Until everything turned to crap.
Well, and there was the GeoCities, like the first Facebook, which is now completely out. It's completely taken out. But, sorry about that, Jerry.
It's all right, I made my money.
So, but that's a good point. So I was incredibly jealous. You made your money, and I was thinking to myself, wow, how come everything I touch is turned to gold like these guys? And then 10 years later, I'm reading again, and then we met and started talking, and you mentioned how you kind of had this period where you went through your dark days. And I didn't really, and I still don't really understand what you meant by that. Like, what went from gold to darkness? Perhaps we can kind of kick off. And then just in terms of format, we have no idea what we're going to talk about. We're just going to riff after that. We planned that question, but then we're going to riff after that.
So the way I see that time was 1999, 2000, early 2001 was a mind-bending time for me. I remember December 1999. How many people were involved in the internet back then? Do you remember when Yahoo was added to the S&P 500? Remember that day? I think on a pre-split basis, Yahoo went from like $20 a share to like $500 a share. And because we had sold GeoCities, I was sitting on a lot of shares of Yahoo. We sold GeoCities to Yahoo. And it was crazy. I don't tell that story for sympathy. I get it. But the next year and a half happened to coincide, I think, with turning 38. And I oftentimes talk about waking up and just feeling hollow inside. And feeling that not only was the portfolio going to hell in a handbasket, August 2001, Industry Standard, where I was on the board of directors, went into bankruptcy, and I got an airplane and went to the Grand Canyon for 2 weeks, completely off the grid. And I was so grateful to be off the grid, because I didn't have to take a single phone call. And that time period was this odd time period of really being lost. I was fat. I was hating myself. And I didn't know who I was. And everybody thought everything was great. And my partner Fred Wilson, wanted to leave JP Morgan's nest and go out and raise a fund, and I just couldn't do it. I couldn't commit to raising money. And on September 10th, 2001, I agreed to take a job at JP Morgan. And on September 11th, 2001, I was at LaGuardia, and I boarded the last flight out down to Washington, and I was sitting next to Tom Daschle, who was Senate Majority Leader, when the Secret Service rushed in and said, "Senator, the United States is under attack." And all I know is that, it felt like a dream. And I agreed to work at JP Morgan, February 2nd, 2002. I wake up, and I just want to die. Just wanted to die. And there was a quote I read at the time, attributed to Buzz Aldrin, who supposedly had said, after he'd suffered a depression, after orbiting the Earth, becoming the first human to orbit the Earth. And the quote was, "When you've seen the Earth from the vantage point of the moon, what else is there?" And I felt that I'd seen the Earth from the vantage point of the moon. And what else was I supposed to live for? I had done it. And it wasn't enough. So, I hope that wasn't too long-winded, but describe it as this sort of nadir point in my life. February 2nd, 2010.
Jerry, do you think that, the 90s were such a boom for everyone, really? Like, it was an unbelievable rush. It really felt like there's a sense that money was always growing on the trees. Maybe not to GeoCities extent, but the salaries were up, stocks were up, everything was up. And then you mentioned 9/11, but it's been really like an entire decade of kind of unraveling, of societal unraveling, where you had kind of the dot-com bust, which seemed to almost put a squash on innovation. Then you had 9/11, the U.S. is under attack. Then you have corporate corruption across the board, like the tide came in, everybody was corrupt. And I saw it as a part of the 90s was the management of a public company. Every public company was an enron. And then it kept going. So housing bubble and bust, derivatives bubble and bust, huge unemployment, everybody got fired. And hasn't even recovered. We're in a war now I couldn't even find Afghanistan on a map. We've been there for 10 years, or 11 years or whatever. So it sort of feels like the rules are different, but people in general haven't adjusted to that change in rules. And so now you're like a life coach, you've kind of come out the other side. What do you see from your vantage point in terms of that?
Well, I think I have two reactions. One is, I think you're both correct, and I think you're both incorrect. And what I think you're correct in the sense that all of us have been experiencing this sort of interesting, deep, dare I say, existential challenge that mirrors in some ways the deeper question that's going on in our society, as evidenced by and perhaps even catalyzed by the changes and the challenges you've been talking about. What's incorrect about, I think, the premise of your question is that this is an epoch that is somehow unique. And what I mean by that is that human beings have been going through existential pain for as long as there have been human beings. And oftentimes, I think we suffer from the false belief that we're the first to actually discover things, the first to actually feel things, the first to actually go through things. And, during this period of internal exploration, I think I read every single book Amazon sells that remotely touches upon midlife crisis. And what I discovered is that people around the world for thousands of years have been dealing with these questions. I ended up a Buddhist from this period. And a lot of times people will come to me, clients will come to me and say, the stress, I can't deal with this, the work environment, and yes, email is a problem. Yes, your smartphone is a problem. But when the Buddha gave up and sat down underneath the Bodhi tree and said, I ain't going to move until I figure it out, which is the way I think of it, doing it, he didn't have a BlackBerry. He didn't have email. So what was he doing? So, yes, we have been going through a very challenging time, but I think sometimes it's our narcissism that thinks that somehow we have it worse. And in that narcissism, we cut ourselves off from wisdom that's out there. And I don't care which tradition you adhere to. Chances are, if you're suffering from something, somebody somewhere has been suffering it. So find that person and ask them, So you're right.
Well, it's interesting because you look at like the 80s and the 90s, and maybe this kind of search for self was buffered in a large extent by the enormous boom in not necessarily innovation, but money supply. So that kind of, everybody always thinks, if I just hit a certain amount of money, it's going to solve my problems. And it's sort of like in waves, you suddenly realize, money doesn't solve your problems. The best case, it'll solve your money problems. But then you realize it doesn't even really solve your money problems. It allows you to pay your bills that year. But no matter how much money you have, then there's the next wave of problems if you still haven't cleaned house. So it's a little bit what we were talking about earlier. You could paint the outside of your house as beautiful as you want. If the living room's a mess, you're still going to have trouble living in it. And I think what happened is that, and I see this a lot just from my own experience, my living room was a mess for a long time. And it took a lot of work. I'm a very messy person by nature, so it took a lot of work to clean it up. It wasn't easy. Some people see it's easy, but it's very difficult.
Well, that's one of the things that drew me to your work, James. Dan was actually the first person to point you out to me. And I started reading your blog. And when I first encountered it, not only did I find someone who, like me, was an erotic mess, but he was unafraid of saying he was an erotic mess, which in my book is a huge win. It's a huge step forward. Because the truth is, we're all kind of neurotic messes. We're kind of humans. And you wrote, and you write, with a rawness and a penetrating ability to get at this sort of, to talk about the messes